March 1943. A gray French port on the Atlantic coast, the kind of place that smells like diesel, cold salt water, and bad news. A German submarine limps in like a wounded animal. The boat's hull is scuffed and warped from depth charges. The propeller's been knocked out of true. Inside, the air is sour, oil, sweat, and that metallic panic you can't wash off. The crew looks like they aged 5 years in one patrol. The captain steps onto the dock and tries to stand tall, but you can tell he's running on fumes. His last 18 hours were spent underwater, silent, listening to British escorts above him, circling, searching, waiting. Like wolves that somehow already know where the deer is hiding, he walks into headquarters and hands over his patrol report, and the numbers are brutal. Weeks at sea, 0 Allied ships sunk. Multiple close calls, near-death moments, each one caused by British corvettes and destroyers that kept finding him again and again, even when he did everything U-boat crews were trained to do. Dive deep, go quiet, hide, wait. Across the table, a senior commander scans the report, then looks up with the same question German U-boat command has been choking on for months. How are they finding you? The captain doesn't have an answer, and neither do the other captains coming back to port. Because something has flipped in the Atlantic. This isn't the early war anymore, when U-boats stalked the sea lanes like they own the place. Now it feels like the ocean itself has turned against them. The hunters are being hunted. And here's the wild part. Decades later, if you learned World War II from movies, you'd swear the U-boat threat was smashed mainly by America showing up with shiny new tech, endless ships, and dramatic last-second hero moments. Hollywood loves that story. But the hard truth is messier and honestly more interesting. Britain didn't just hang on until the U.S. arrived. Britain fought this submarine war from the first day of the war, and Britain built the methods that started breaking the U-boat threat before American forces entered the Atlantic in big numbers. The Germans who survived knew it. They didn't need a movie to tell them who the real problem was. So if you want the real story of how the Atlantic turned into a U-boat graveyard, you've got to rewind. All the way back to the beginning, and real quick. If you like WW2 stories that cut through the myth and get to what actually happened, hit subscribe and keep that bell on. You don't want to miss the next part of this one. Now, September 3rd, 1939, Britain declares war on Germany. That same day, a German U-boat fires torpedoes at a civilian liner, the SS Athenia. The ship goes down and civilians die, men, women, families. Among them are Americans too. The message is clear. The Atlantic is going to be a killing ground. Germany has a plan, and on paper, it's smart. Britain is an island nation. It can't feed itself without imports. It needs food, oil, raw materials, everything delivered by ships crossing the Atlantic. Cut those sea lanes and Britain doesn't just struggle. Britain starves, factories slow, planes don't fly, tanks don't roll, war ends. So Germany sends its submarines out to choke Britain's lifeline, and early on, it works. Not perfectly, not instantly, but enough to be terrifying, because merchant ships sailing alone are easy prey. A U-boat can wait, strike, vanish. One torpedo can ruin a ship and everyone on it in seconds. By 1940 and into early 1941, the losses stack up. Month after month, the tonnage numbers climb into the hundreds of thousands. At that pace, Britain's math starts looking like a countdown. And the fear in London is real. Winston Churchill would later say, the U-boat danger was the thing that truly scared him during the war. That's not drama, that's survival, because Britain isn't fighting for pride out there. Britain is fighting so there's food on shelves and fuel in tanks. And here's the key. Britain is also fighting mostly alone in this Atlantic battle for a long stretch of time. Yes, the U.S. is helping in certain ways before officially entering the war. Lend-lease, escorts in some zones, politics shifting. But the full American wartime machine, the massive Atlantic presence people picture from movies, isn't there yet. So early on, Britain's Royal Navy and its merchant sailors are the ones taking the punches. And at the start, British anti-submarine warfare is rough. They have escorts, destroyers, corvettes, but not enough of them. Training is uneven, gear is improving, but still limited. Escorts are often thrown together into temporary groups, ships and crews who don't know each other well, trying to guard a convoy in freezing seas against an enemy that can hide under the water. A submarine doesn't need to win every fight. It only needs to sink enough ships to make Britain collapse. So Britain has to do something bigger than try harder. Britain has to evolve. And this is where the story shifts from desperation to something like science, trial and error under fire, because Britain begins turning convoy defense into a system, not just bravery but process, discipline, procedure, learning from every contact, every attack, every mistake. First, the convoy idea itself becomes the backbone. Instead of merchant ships scattering across the ocean alone, Britain groups them together, 30 ships in one guarded formation. It sounds like making a bigger target, but it's actually the opposite. A U-boat wants lonely prey. A convoy forces the submarine to attack where there are escorts ready to fight back. And the math matters. One escort can protect a large cluster better than it can protect dozens of ships spread out across hundreds of miles. So Germany adapts too. The U-boats coordinate. They form wolf packs. Multiple submarines work together. Spot, radio, converge, overwhelm. On paper, it should crush convoys. In reality, it creates a new problem for Germany. Wolf packs require communication. Communication creates signals. Signals can be detected, and British escorts start learning how to turn the U-boat's own system against them. At the same time, British technology begins to sharpen, not as a single magic invention, more like a toolkit that keeps getting better. British escorts use sonar, known early on as ASDIC, to search for submarines underwater. It's not perfect. Sea conditions can mess with it. Temperature layers can bend sound. Range can be limited, but Britain keeps refining it, and crews keep learning what the pings really mean in real combat, not in a classroom. Then there are depth charges. At first, depth charges are basically rolling explosives off the back of a ship and hoping you guessed the right spot and depth. That's a recipe for wasted ammo and missed kills. But Britain improves how depth charges are used. Patterns, timing, coordination, so they're not just tossing explosives into the ocean. They're boxing a submarine in. For a U-boat crew, that's not just scary. It's exhausting, because surviving depth charges isn't one moment. It's hours. Hours of holding your breath, literally and mentally. Hours of hearing propellers above you. Hours of metal groaning as shock waves slap the hull. And the British begin doing something that feels almost unfair. They get patient. They stop treating escorts like guards who just chase off attackers. They start thinking like hunters. If they get contact, they don't always rush. They don't always fire and break off. They circle. They coordinate. They keep the pressure on until the submarine makes a mistake, runs out of battery, runs out of air, panics, rises, or turns at the wrong time. And that's when the depth charges fall like a hammer. On top of that, British radar gets better too, moving from early limited sets into more capable gear that can spot small targets on the surface in darkness and bad weather. That matters because U-boats aren't underwater all the time. They surface to recharge batteries, to move faster, to send messages, to reposition. A submarine on the surface at night used to be a ghost. Now it's a blip. And as Britain keeps tightening these screws, convoys, sonar improvements, radar improvements, better escort training, the Atlantic begins to change. Not overnight, not with one winning battle, but with a trend. More U-boats are being spotted, more U-boats are being forced down, more U-boats are being damaged, chased off, or destroyed, and German captains start coming back to port saying the same thing in different words. This isn't like before. They're finding us. That's why the scene in 1943 matters so much. That exhausted captain walking into headquarters isn't confused because he's bad at his job. He's confused because what used to work isn't working anymore. He's realizing that the British have stopped improvising and started mastering the craft. And if you were Germany, you'd still cling to hope at this point. You'd tell yourself, we'll build more boats, we'll adjust tactics, we'll outlast them. But the ocean doesn't care about hope. The Atlantic is a numbers game, and it's a learning game. And Britain has been learning the hard way since 1939, every week, every convoy, every freezing night. So the question becomes, what exactly did Britain do that made German U-boat captains feel like prey? And why do so many later stories act like this turning only happened after America showed up in full force? Because when you look at the timeline closely, especially around 1941, you start to see the shift forming earlier than most people think. And you start to see something else too. it wasn't just ships and weapons. It was information. Because the most dangerous thing in war isn't a gun you can see. It's an enemy who knows where you are before you even arrive. And that's where Part 2 goes, into the British toolkit that made the Atlantic lethal for U-boats, and the intelligence edge that made German plans fall apart in a way that felt impossible. To understand why that German captain in 1943 felt like the ocean had turned against him, you have to picture what a U-boat actually needed to survive. It needed three things. First, time on the surface, because batteries don't last forever and underwater speed is slow. Second, radio contact, because wolf packs don't coordinate by vibes, they coordinate by messages. Third, darkness and bad weather, because a U-boat is most dangerous when it can see you before you see it. Britain attacked all three. Not with one miracle weapon, with a system built step by step, paid for in cold water and broken ships. Start with the radio problem. Germany's submarines weren't lone sharks forever. The big threat came from coordination. A U-boat would spot a convoy, then send a message. Headquarters would route other boats into position. Then the pack would hit from different angles, at night, on the surface, fast. That sounded unstoppable, until British escorts got better at finding the sender. High-frequency direction finding, what sailors nicknamed Huff Duff, could pick up a U-boat transmission and give a bearing. One ship might not get an exact fix, but a group could combine bearings, narrow the area, and move fast. And suddenly sending that harmless message wasn't harmless anymore. Every time a U-boat talked, it lit a small flare in the dark. British escorts learned to treat those signals like footprints. They didn't just defend the convoy line. They started hunting outward. Now add radar. Early radar could spot surface ships, but it wasn't always reliable. And a U-boat's conning tower isn't exactly a battleship. But Britain kept pushing the tech forward, especially with radar sets that could pick up smaller targets at night and in nasty weather. This mattered because U-boats loved night attacks. On the surface, at night, a U-boat is fast and hard to see. That's where it could shadow a convoy, choose its angle, slip close, fire, and disappear. Radar made that harder. A U-boat captain who used to feel safe in darkness starts seeing shells splash nearby before he even realizes he's been detected. So now you've hit two key U-boat advantages. Radio coordination becomes risky, night surface operations become risky, but Britain still has a problem. Even if you spot a submarine, how do you kill it? This is where anti-submarine warfare turns into something technical and mean. Sonar, ASDIC, was the main underwater eye, but sonar has a frustrating weakness. When an escort ship passes directly over the submarine, the contact can get messy or drop for a moment. And in war, one moment is all you need to lose your target. So escorts needed better attack methods. Depth charges were the classic tool, and Britain got smarter with them. Instead of a couple blasts and a prayer, escorts began dropping charges in patterns, planned spreads meant to bracket the likely position, not just the last place the sonar operator felt the contact. And then came an even nastier upgrade, weapons that could be launched forward, so the escort could keep sonar contact while attacking. The most famous of these was Hedgehog, multiple small bombs fired ahead of the ship, landing in a spread. Instead of losing sonar contact while you pass over the target, you're striking in front of you while still tracking. And that changes everything, because now a U-boat can't rely on the escort overshooting. It can't rely on one lucky turn during that brief blind moment. The British are learning how to stay glued to the submarine like a shadow. Now, put these pieces together. Imagine you're a U-boat commander in 1941 or 1942. You're trying to reach a convoy. You have to surface sometimes. You have to transmit sometimes. You want to attack at night on the surface. But radar might catch you in the dark. Huff Duff might sniff your transmissions. Escorts are getting better at holding sonar contact. Their depth charge patterns are tighter, and their forward-throwing weapons reduce your escape windows. That's why German captains started writing in reports and telling interrogators later that something felt different. Not mystical, not luck. Different because the British were building a layered defense that punished every normal U-boat habit. And Britain didn't just do this with technology. Britain did it with organization. Early in the war, convoy escorts were often thrown together. Whatever destroyers and small escorts were available, Crews rotated, tactics were inconsistent. One group might be aggressive, another might be cautious. Sometimes a convoy survived because the escorts clicked. Other times it died because they didn't. Over time, Britain started creating dedicated escort groups, ships that trained together, learned together, and fought the same enemy over and over. This sounds boring until you realize what it means in combat. It means a sonar operator knows how his captain reacts. It means ships can coordinate without hesitation. It means they develop plays for different situations. How to search, how to trap, how to keep contact, how to swap roles when one ship runs low on fuel or depth charges. That's how you turn a bunch of ships into a pack. And if you're a submarine crew underwater hearing multiple escorts coordinate above you, it's terrifying because you're not fighting one opponent, you're fighting a team. This is also where Britain embraces a new mindset. Don't just escort, hunt. Instead of treating escorts like bodyguards who only react after an attack, Britain develops support groups that can move toward trouble and stay in an area to destroy submarines. And once the British start hunting, U-boats lose another advantage because a U-boat wants to strike and run. A hunting group wants to stick around and finish the job. Now there's one more huge piece, maybe the most important piece, because it makes all the other pieces sharper. Information. The German Navy relied heavily on coded radio messages, orders, patrol lines, regroup points, updates. If an enemy could read that traffic, the enemy wouldn't just react to U-boats. The enemy could avoid them or trap them. This is where Britain's intelligence war becomes a sledgehammer. British code breakers at Bletchley Park were working relentlessly to read German naval signals, but the naval Enigma system was especially tough. More complex settings, more disciplined procedures. Then, in 1941, Britain gets something priceless: captured materials from a U-boat. One of the major early breakthroughs came after a British warship forced a U-boat to the surface, and a boarding party recovered codebooks and cipher-related items before the submarine sank. That kind of capture was insanely dangerous, boarding a damaged, sinking enemy submarine while the sea is still full of threats. But those seizures mattered, because once you have the right materials, the math becomes possible faster. And when the math becomes possible, the ocean stops being random. Convoys can be routed away from danger zones. Hunting groups can be sent toward places where submarines are forming up. Even when Britain couldn't read everything all the time, even partial insight, combined with radio direction finding, could tilt the game. Think about how that feels from the German side. You plan a wolf pack, you set patrol lines, you move boats into position, and somehow the convoy doesn't show. Or worse, escorts show up early, already searching, already aggressive. To German commanders, it looked like Britain had supernatural luck, or spies everywhere, or some brand new detection method. But the real answer was colder. Britain was getting better at understanding German intentions before the attack even began. Now, combine intelligence with air power, and things get even uglier for the U-boats. For a long time, the mid-Atlantic had a deadly gap, too far from land for aircraft to cover. U-boats loved that zone. They could surface more safely and stalk convoys. Britain pushes to close that gap with a practical idea: small aircraft carriers that can travel with convoys. Escort carriers, not giant fleet carriers. Smaller, often converted hulls, built for the job of keeping aircraft over the convoy lanes. Britain was experimenting with this concept early, and when one of the first escort carriers entered service, it immediately proved the point. Aircraft overhead force submarines down, and submarines forced down can't sprint into position, can't attack as easily, and can't shadow the convoy comfortably. Even if the planes don't sink a U-boat every time, they change the rules. A U-boat on the surface is dangerous. A U-boat underwater is slower, blind, and burning battery. So air cover becomes another pressure layer, and that pressure layer stacks on radar, on Huff Duff, on sonar, on better escort teamwork, on smarter weapon use, on intelligence. This is why the Atlantic flips. Not because Britain got lucky in 1 month, because Britain built a system that punished the U-boats every day. And as this system matures, you start getting legendary results. Escort groups that become feared because they don't just chase submarines away, they finish them. Certain British commanders became known for relentless pursuit, holding contact for hours, swapping ships to maintain pressure, using coordinated approaches to keep the submarine boxed in until it either broke apart or was forced to surface. That's not Hollywood drama. That's the grind. The kind of warfare where victory is measured in endurance and technique, not speeches. And it explains the problem with the popular movie version of the Atlantic. Movies love the moment where America arrives and solves the problem. But by the time American forces are operating in large numbers in the Atlantic, Britain has already been fighting this war for years, and many of the core ideas are already in place. Convoy discipline-trained escort groups, sonar-based tracking, and coordinated attacks, radar-driven surface detection direction finding against U-boat signals, escort carriers for mid-ocean air cover intelligence used to reroute and intercept. None of that diminishes America's role. America's industrial output and growing naval presence mattered a lot, but it does change the story. Because it means the Atlantic campaign isn't mainly America saves Britain. It's Britain survives long enough, learns fast enough, and builds a deadly system. Then America adds the weight that makes German defeat permanent. And that brings us back to that exhausted German captain in 1943. He's not asking, why are the British brave? He's asking, why do the British seem to know what we're doing? Because when your enemy gets good at detection, good at teamwork, good at technology, and good at intelligence, you stop feeling like a predator. You start feeling like the ocean has eyes. Now here's the next step in the story, the step that turns "this is getting bad" into "this is hopeless" for Germany. There's a specific stretch of time when U-boat losses spike so hard that German command has to pull back. A moment where the numbers become impossible, and when that happens, the Battle of the Atlantic stops being a question. It becomes a verdict. By early 1943, German U-boat crews could feel it coming. Patrols were getting shorter, not because missions were easier, but because boats were coming home damaged, hunted down, or not coming home at all. The Atlantic was no longer a place where skill and patience guaranteed survival. It had become a numbers grinder. And May 1943 broke whatever hope Germany still had left. That month, the losses crossed from serious into unsustainable. 41 U-boats were destroyed in a single month. 41. Germany was building submarines as fast as it could, roughly 30 per month. But losing more than that meant the math was upside down. Crews couldn't be trained fast enough. Experience vanished faster than it could be replaced. This wasn't a temporary spike, it was collapse. And the response from German Naval Command was immediate and telling. U-boats were pulled back from the North Atlantic. The campaign designed to starve Britain into surrender was effectively abandoned. The Atlantic battle, the one meant to decide the war early, was lost. Now here's where the record matters. When you look at who was actually sinking those submarines in that decisive period, the picture doesn't match the movie version. In May 1943, the majority of U-boats destroyed were sunk by British and Canadian forces. American forces absolutely contributed, but they accounted for a smaller share. The ratio wasn't an accident. It reflected years of experience. British escort groups had been refining their craft since 1939. They weren't improvising anymore. They were executing a mature system. Support groups, units designed to hunt submarines rather than just guard convoys, roamed the Atlantic. Escort carriers kept aircraft overhead in areas that used to be safe for U-boats. Radar, sonar, and radio direction finding worked together. Intelligence guided ships toward danger instead of stumbling into it. From the German perspective, this was the nightmare scenario. Captured German assessments from the time say it plainly. British anti-submarine methods had evolved beyond what German countermeasures could defeat. The escorts didn't just react, they anticipated. American forces were there. They were brave, they were effective, and their industrial output mattered enormously. But they were joining a campaign that had already turned. One German naval analysis after the May losses concluded that British escort carriers, British hunting groups, and British intelligence were the primary reasons the Atlantic could no longer be contested. American forces were strengthening a victory already in motion, not creating it from scratch. This distinction matters because after the war, the story changes. Hollywood steps in. Films center American crews in Atlantic battles that look, feel, and function exactly like British escort actions from earlier years. American destroyers fight wolf packs using tactics pioneered by British groups. American escort carriers are framed as the breakthrough, even though Britain tested, deployed, and proved the concept first. One movie in particular goes further, showing American sailors capturing German Enigma materials in a dramatic boarding operation. The real captures, the ones that cracked naval Enigma and reshaped the Atlantic, were British, carried out in 1941 before America entered the war. British sailors boarded sinking submarines under fire to grab codebooks and machines. British cryptanalysts exploited them. British intelligence used the information to reroute convoys and spring traps. The film eventually added a disclaimer, but disclaimers don't erase 2 hours of powerful storytelling. So a generation grows up believing America won the Atlantic by swooping in with superior technology and courage, while Britain played a supporting role. The statistics tell a different story. British forces destroyed far more German submarines than American forces over the course of the war. British casualties in the Atlantic were vastly higher, not because they were careless, but because they fought longer, earlier, and under worse conditions. Royal Navy sailors, Coastal Command air crews, and merchant seamen were dying in freezing water years before the U.S. entered the war in full force. Convoys sailed short-handed. Escorts went back out exhausted, low on fuel and depth charges, because stopping meant starvation. That experience forged expertise. German survivors noticed it. Post-war interviews with former U-boat commanders repeat the same theme. American forces were dangerous because they had numbers. British forces were feared because they had mastery. British escorts hunted patiently. They understood submarine behavior. They knew when a boat would try to slip away, when it would run deep, when it would lie still and hope. And they had the discipline to stay on top of a contact for 10 hours, 12 hours longer if needed. Some escort groups became legendary among U-boat crews. Hearing certain sonar patterns or recognizing certain tactics meant one thing. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a death sentence. That reputation didn't come from a single battle. It came from years of repetition, adaptation, and relentless pressure. The escort carrier story shows the same pattern. Britain developed the idea, deployed it early, and proved it worked. American industry later built escort carriers in large numbers and used them effectively, but the concept, the doctrine, and the lessons were British first. This isn't about diminishing America's role. America mattered. America's ships, planes, and crews helped seal the defeat and ensured Germany could never recover. But sealing a victory is not the same as creating it. By the time American power fully arrived in the Atlantic, Britain had already survived the worst, learned how to fight back, and turn the tide. German historians acknowledged it. German officers acknowledged it. Even German veterans decades later acknowledged it. They lost to America eventually, but they lost to Britain first. That truth doesn't disappear because it's less convenient for blockbuster storytelling. Sometimes the side that wins doesn't do it in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it wins by refusing to quit when quitting would make sense, by fighting from the first day of the war, by innovating under pressure, and by paying a terrible price to stay alive. Britain did that in the Atlantic. America helped finish the job. And the U-boats, the men who lived and died inside steel tubes beneath the sea, knew exactly which enemy taught them fear. If this changed how you see the Battle of the Atlantic, share it with someone who still thinks Hollywood got it right. And stick around for more WW2 stories that don't flinch from the record.